Call of Duty Black Ops 4 is a very demanding game. Do you want your game to look like this, or do you want it to look like that? Today I will show you all the graphic settings that will give you an advantage when you first play this game yourself. You do not want to spend half an hour trying to figure out which settings to turn on or to turn off when you first join a server. It's probably the last thing that you want. You waited long enough and you want to actually play Blackout, right? That is why I decided to make this video. I want to give you an advantage from the start. There's even a setting that will remove parts of the terrain, like rocks and so on, so that you can now clearly see your enemy who thinks he is safely hiding behind cover. We will do multiple things today. We will check out the performance with an RTX 2080 Ti, we will check out what all of these settings actually do, and we will compare the difference in frames per second. Near the end of the video we will check out the final result of the ultimate settings for Call of Duty Black Ops 4. The frame rates that you see in the top left corner are there as a reference, just to give you an idea of the potential impact of these settings on your game. These frame rates were achieved by a PC which has an RTX 2080 Ti and an Intel i7 6900K running the game in 4K. It's usually not such a great idea to mess around with the render resolution, but we will do it anyway, just to see what would happen. In this scene, with very high settings, we get an average of 81 frames per second. This is our starting point, so remember that number. You can change the render resolution all the way from 50 to 200, but if you set it to 200, then you will immediately notice that the VRAM usage jumps up to a number far beyond the capabilities of the RTX 2080 Ti. If you then go to the game itself, then you can clearly see that this is just unplayable. But it looks great, with an amazing level of detail. But 21 frames per second is just not good enough. You could turn this setting all the way down to 50. This will give you almost 200 frames per second. But the view that you get is so blurry that this is also unplayable. So leave it where it was at 100 and move on to the other settings. Like in most games, you can change your brightness. This setting depends on your personal preference and on your monitor. It has no impact on the performance of the game, so feel free to choose whatever you prefer. Same goes for the display gamma. This is an important setting for content creators, and there is an underlying reason for that. But for a pure gamer, it just depends on what you prefer, because there is no performance impact. You will be able to notice a color difference between these two because Rec 709 will give you slightly darker colors. Over to the good stuff, details and textures. Here you can drastically improve your game's graphics, but also your frames per second. The texture quality allows you to adjust the resolution for the textures. In this scene you can clearly see that on the door and on the wooden floor. Very high clearly shows you the grains. These are the lines that you can see in the wood. Changing the texture quality to high already makes these lines blurry and most of them will disappear. The same goes for some of the finer details on your weapon. It will all disappear as soon as you step away from very high. The lower that you go with this setting, the more of these details that you will lose. Going from very high to high gains you one single frame. Going from high to medium wins you another 2 frames. And low gives you another 2 extra frames in 4K. The total gain of going from very high to low is 5 frames. The downside is that the textures will become very blurry, and there are also some details that are now completely missing from the game. The best way to show you the difference between very high and low is with this flag. High shows you a nice flag with a great texture, and on low it looks like a blurry mess. The texture filtering quality can use the colors of a nearby pixel to show you the color of another pixel. In reality, you won't be able to see the difference in Call of Duty, and there is no performance impact, so you might as well leave it on high. The special effects quality changes the quality of the resolution that is used for special effects such as fire. Strangely enough, it also affects the grain of the wood, and changing it to medium blurs the grain again in a very similar way as when we changed the texture quality. All the other settings, so low and very low, don't have a noticeable impact on the game in this scene. I tried playing around with fire and then changing the special effects quality, but there wasn't a consistent difference between all of these settings, so set this to high and leave it where it is unless you are suffering from frame rate drops when you're looking directly at a source of fire. The model quality setting is a very important setting and it can help you in ways you never imagined. According to the description in Call of Duty, it adjusts the smoothness of the models in the environment. A higher quality will result in a higher number of shapes. In other words, a higher setting is smoother and it will give you more shapes. This might mean absolutely nothing to you, but it should really mean a lot. Focus on higher setting, more shapes. So the higher the setting, the more shapes you're going to see on models in the environment. Models in the environment are things like rocks and other obstructions that can block your view of an enemy who is hiding behind that rock. Now that we know that, let's change the description and it should be clear now what this setting does. A higher setting creates more shapes on rocks. But this also means that the lower setting creates less shapes on rocks. To see where I'm going with this, a lower setting will basically remove parts of rocks. So your enemy, if he is playing on high, might think that you can't see him. But a smart player like yourself will be playing on low, and now you can easily give the poor guy a headshot because there is no rock, at least not for you. Remember the Matrix? Just before Neo meets the Oracle, there is this kid that bends a spoon with his mind, and then he tells Neo that there is no spoon. This is me telling you that there is no rock. So this is your Matrix moment, so let's take a look at this. What you see now is the game with the model quality set to high. Take a look at the rocks just in front of the water here. Focus on the one next to the barrel of the gun and on the rocks to the left of that rock. If I go from high to low, then you're going to see this. Half of this rock is now gone. Completely gone. A guy hiding behind it is now exposed. The same thing happened on the left side but in a lesser extent, but still the top parts of these rocks are now gone. The rock next to the barrel is now cut in half. So remember this. There is no rock, and just put the model quality setting to low. Just for info, there is no difference in frame rate. Not that it should matter because this advantage is just way too good. Oh, by the way, there are even some pieces of wood missing, so who knows what else might magically disappear in front of your enemy. The static reflection quality has an effect on reflections, for example on the reflections in the water and on your weapon. If you focus on the water on the left hand side, then you can see the reflection of the terrain. Medium blurs this reflection a little bit, and low pretty much removes this reflection altogether. There is no change in FPS, so feel free to choose whatever you prefer. There is a chance that one of these settings will make it easier to spot an enemy who is diving, but I will confirm that for you in another video. The screen space reflection allows you to see the reflection of certain graphics on reflective surfaces. In the image that they show you next to the setting, you can see the leaves being reflected in the water on the right hand side. This might mean that it is possible that we can see an enemy player being reflected in the water. But again, I will confirm that for you later when I had more time playing Black Ops 4. For now, there are no performance changes with this setting on or off. The objective view distance has no effect on your FPS in this scene because it affects the distance at which small objects are visible, and I couldn't see any difference to be honest. The difference between the shadow quality setting is only noticeable when you set it to low. It causes a dramatic change to the shadows. You can still see them, but they will be less detailed. The great thing is that you will gain 5 frames per second. Dynamic shadows are the shadows that belong to moving objects, like your character for example. You have the option to choose between all, self-only or off. Self-only means that you can then only see your own shadow. There wasn't a change in the FPS in our scene because I couldn't see my own shadow anyway. When I then look down and look at my own shadow, then you will gain about 7 FPS by turning this setting off. The special effects shadow gives shadows to particles and special effects. Pretty self-explanatory, right? And I don't really see the need for these things to have shadows in the first place. If you turn this off, then you will gain 2 frames. The weapon shadow is also pretty self-explanatory. It casts a shadow on your left hand, for example. You will gain approximately 2 frames, so I think it's a good trade-off because I don't see the need to be able to see your own weapon shadow, so you might as well turn this setting off. You can adjust the global illumination quality, but only in Blackout. Default makes the shadows of some of these plants a little bit less dark, and that makes it a little bit easier to spot enemies. This effect is most noticeable when you're indoors. On default, it seems that there is a light source coming in through the windows, and this lights up the walls and the ceiling. This makes this scene pretty convincing. However, the walls of this little booth in the middle is now darker, making it more difficult to see what is going on over there. If we then use the low setting, then this wall lights up again. But now the light is not realistic anymore that is coming through the windows, and the walls and the ceilings have pretty much the same color and they're also darker. So it's a trade-off. Certain items can become darker or lighter. Performance-wise, there is a big difference. Indoors you will get about 5 frames more, and outdoors you will get about 3 frames more. So for now, use the low settings. Take advantage of the FPS gain while you get used to Blackout. After a few days, then try the default setting and see if it benefits you more in terms of darker or lighter parts on the map. And now, over to the big hitters, the setting that will affect your FPS the most, starting with the anti-aliasing quality. It will smooth out jagged edges, but this comes at a high cost. The effect is most noticeable on the wall in front of you. The top part will be smoother, with higher settings. This is very clear when we slowly move around from left to right. You will gain 6 frames in 4K when you turn this setting off when you're stationary, but when you move around you will win 10 frames. Ambient occlusion creates soft shadows that can intersect. This is a setting that is barely noticeable, especially in this scene, but it did give a performance boost of 4 frames. Subsurface scattering gives you more realistic human faces and it simulates the light being absorbed and diffused when passing through different materials. I didn't notice anything visually, but we gained 1 frame. Order-independent transparency allows you to select the amount of transparent effects and objects that are sorted when looking through them. It helps to create some depth when you look through these objects. In-game, this works very different than how I imagined this setting. With order-independent transparency on, it appears that there is a mist or fog everywhere, even on a sunny day. Look at what happens when you turn this off. Now the mist is gone, and everything looks much nicer. Objects and enemies will be much easier to spot when you turn the setting off, because it looks like a filter that you're just removing. On top of that, you win another 6 frames. I didn't discuss motion blur because, well, most people turn it off anyway, especially in shooters. I did a test when moving to see the difference in FPS and there was none, so it depends on personal preference. But I think that most of us prefer to turn this off, so just turn it off. If you freeze a frame with motion blur on, then it looks like this. Pretty bad, hey? If you know that it can look like this, then it is pretty obvious what you should choose. So I hope that I've been able to convince the non-believers. To summarize, the ultimate graphics settings for Call of Duty Black Ops 4 are: texture quality to very high, texture filtering to high, special effects quality high as well, model quality to low, static reflection quality to high, screen space reflection on, objective view distance high, shadow quality low, which gives you 5 extra frames, dynamic shadows to off for another 7 frames, but only if you look at them, special effects shadow off for 2 frames, the weapon shadow to off for 2 frames, global illumination quality to low for 5 extra frames, anti-aliasing quality off 6 frames when stationary and 10 frames when moving, ambient occlusion off for 4 frames, motion blur to off, subsurface scattering off for 1 extra frame, and order-independent transparency off for another 6 frames. A total gain of 31 frames, but when we actually combine all of these settings together, then you can see that we went from an average of 81 frames to an average of 119 frames. That is a total combined gain of 38 frames. If we then look down at where our shadows would have been, then we gain another 7 frames, and if you move around, then we gain another 4 frames thanks to the low anti-aliasing setting, so a potential gain of 49 frames per second in 4K, and we made our gaming experience better at the same time. As always, if you play in a lower resolution, then this difference in FPS should be bigger, so you will get a greater benefit out of this video. On top of that, some settings just give you a big advantage over the rest of the players, like the removal of the rocks and the removal of the mist, for example. If you want to get your hands on Call of Duty Black Ops 4 or on the RTX 2080 Ti, then use the affiliate link in the video description. This was the cheapest price that I could find. Make sure to like and subscribe to Fog of Gaming if you haven't done so already, and make sure that you check out the next Call of Duty Black Ops 4 video.
Mercs will think twice before trying that again.